Hello and welcome. I'm Susan Murray, Director of the David Hume Institute, which for those of you that are new to our work, we're an independent think tank based in Scotland. We carry out research and host public events on a range of issues related to the economy and society in Scotland. Now, before I hand over to our chair for today, Ailsa Macfarlane from Built Environment Forum in Scotland, I'd like to cover a few things about how the event will work. We are recording the session and it will be uploaded to our website afterwards. Closed captioning is enabled, so if you would like subtitles, please use the button to switch on at the bottom of your screen in your Zoom screen window. There's chat function that's been left on, so we can share links and introduce yourself to other guests if you want to. And they'll, in terms of the running order, there'll be approximately 25 minutes of speaker conversation before we move into questions from the audience. With the questions, just to let you know, you can post them in the Q&A section using the button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll invite you to unmute so that you can ask your question directly in your own words to the presenters. And when asking your question, if possible, please state your name and, if applicable, your organisation. If you're unable to unmute, can you put that in your question? Because it just helps us know, and we'll ask the question for you. So as we near the end of the event, we may group the questions as we try to get through as many as possible. So without further ado, I'm delighted to hand you over to our chair for this morning, Ailsa Macfarlane. Ailsa has been with BEFS since 2017, initially in a policy and strategy role before becoming director in 2021. She has experience leading nationwide cultural heritage skills and training projects. Ailsa has wide-ranging involvement with partnership working, stakeholder collaboration, and across the sector. She takes an inclusive and cooperative approach with a passion for increasing sector sustainability. She aims to distill the complexity of across policy landscapes. Gosh, this is a good introduction, Ailsa. From working with you, I know in partnership, you do all of this every day. So without further ado, over to Ailsa. I'm going to turn my camera off and just help you behind the scenes with the questions. Welcome, everybody.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Susan. And thank you to everybody who's joined us today. Looking at the expected attendees, it's a very well-informed audience, so I'm hoping that everybody will have a lot to say. I'd also like to note that it's International Women's Day, and as two organisations that are currently female-led, we really are delighted to be working in collaboration to help further policy understanding, and we hope in time further development of the practical application of the access to data, which we really know is of benefit to all. This event and Andy's paper is part of driving that conversation and widening the understanding of what is needed for the future of all of our places. The David Hume Institute and BEFS have been working both separately and together for many years in relation to access to data. Both of our organisations see the benefits that better access to building and land data can bring, socially, economically, and in relation to meeting net zero goals. Whether our ongoing work is about place and policy, or economy and society, or an interwoven tapestry of all of the above, we're really keen to engage around policy change to inform better practices, which in turn, we hope can bring benefits to people. As Susan said, please do get your questions into the Q&A box, and we will be coming to those once we've heard from our two speakers. I'm also delighted to see so many people introducing yourselves to each other in the chat. Please do that. It's left open for those purposes. We're going to hear from our two speakers, including an overview of the new briefing paper released today, which has been authored by Andy Wightman. I'll introduce our speakers first. Andy is a writer, a researcher. He has a focus on land governance, land ownership, and community land rights. He's authored many publications, including Who Owns Scotland, Scotland, Land and Power, Community Land Rights, A Citizen's Guide, and The Poor Had No Lawyers. He actively runs the Who Owns Scotland project. From 2016 to 2021, Andy was a member of the Scottish Parliament, and he was also previously a special advisor to the House of Commons Scottish Affairs Committee Inquiry on Land Reform, and was also a member of the Commission on Local Tax Reform in 2015. Andy will give us a brief overview of the paper and discuss the critical importance of Scotland's land information system. And Andy will then be followed and he will hand over to Stewart Brymer. Professor Stewart Brymer has over 40 years experience as a solicitor. In 1993, he was the first solicitor in Scotland to be accredited by the Law Society of Scotland as a specialist in commercial leasing law. And in 1999, he also became an accredited specialist in intellectual property law. He's an honorary professor at the University of Dundee. And in 2015, he was awarded an OBE for services to arts and culture in Dundee. So now you've heard about us, I will hand over to Andy to tell us a bit more about ScotLIS, what it is, why it's important, and how we've got to where we are now. And I will just turn myself off.
Thank you very much indeed, Ailsa, and it's good to be joining this morning, and thanks to all of you for joining us. As Ailsa said, my task is to provide you with a summary of what the briefing paper is all about. It's quite a short paper. You can read it in your own time. So land information. What is land information? Well, it's a whole suite of information about land, about its ownership, value, valuation, vegetation cover, hydrology, soils, contamination, environmental, heritage designations, as well as a lot of information on the built environment, things that are built on land, energy efficiency, construction methods, and much, much more. And internationally, land information systems are legal and policy frameworks that govern how information about land is captured, how it's stored, how it's disseminated, how interoperable it is, its use and governance of this wide range of information about land, including, as I say, its tenure, ownership, use, status, value, history, physical condition. And this report is about why Scotland needs such a system and what we have done to date to deliver it. So Ailsa kind of hinted at why we need this. And that's perhaps quite a critical question. It has been a critical question, I think, over the years. Information about land is used by a wide range of people and organizations in academia for research purposes, in business, for commerce, and in government and wider policy making. And the problem, I suppose, is that, in short, although much of this information does exist, it's not available necessarily in an easy-to-use manner, it's not integrated, and it's not coordinated. And on page 7 of the report, I just highlight a number of examples of this. So, for example, data may be unavailable beyond a restricted group of users. And perhaps the most prominent example of this is a wide range of data sets, including forestry and woodland strategies, gritting routes, GP practices, cycling networks that form part of the spatial hub administered by the Improvement Service, but to which access is restricted by the Public Sector Geospatial Agreement, Public Sector Geospatial Agreement members. Despite the fact, of course, all of this information has been collected and aggregated at public expense. A second example would be data that's available to all, but only via a web interface designed by the data holder. And the raw data is not available for use, or is only available for very restricted purposes outside the organisation. And one example of that might be the valuation rule held by the Scottish assessors, to which access to the raw data is not generally available. And then you have data that is held, but not necessarily in an easily accessible format. For example, Registers of Scotland hold a number of registers, including the Register of Persons holding a controlled interest in land, but it's not searchable by map and it's not integrated with other land and property information held by the same organisation. And then you get some data that's held in an inconsistent and very unreliable matter. I was previously recently advising on the sale of a crofting common grazing in Argyll. Now, the sale of this land, which is a common grazing attached to a number of crofting holdings, the sale of this land has been agreed between the landowner and the shareholders of the grazing. but it's been delayed for many years because of inadequate records documenting the identity of every shareholder. And that's holding things up hugely. And then we have finally some data that's really not really available at all. For example, the location and extent of land held under various agricultural tenancies, or a lot of data on the construction and condition of the built environment. So those are just a few examples of some of the issues we face. And Scotlas aims to sort all this out. So what is Scotlas? Well, there's some dispute about what Scotlas really is. Some people say it's Scotland's Land Information Service or Scotland's Land Information System. It's interesting to note that Registers of Scotland have trademarked Scotlas as I understand, as an acronym for Scotland's Land Information System, but we can debate the finer points of that later. The bottom line is that Scotlas was first mooted in the 1990s. It was part of I think a doomsday project initiated by the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors. And the Law Society of Scotland, Registers of Scotland, and the Royal Incorporation, Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors established the project. It never really got anywhere, and I think it got lost in the lead up to the establishment of the Scottish Parliament. Nothing then really happened on land information, generally speaking, until 2015, when there was a major fresh push. And an organisation called Unify Scotland, which was established, I think, by Stewart Brymer, who we'll hear from in a minute, organised a major conference in March 2015. And that was addressed by the Deputy First Minister, John Swinney, and the government agreed to establish an easy-to-use and affordable system for accessing a wide range of information about land and property in Scotland, what they called a one-stop digital database for land and information. And a task force headed by the Keeper of the Registers of Scotland was established and published its report to the Deputy First Minister in July 2015. Now, we have a link to the 2015 report, and it's certainly worth a read. It's quite short for those of you who haven't already read it. It makes recommendations about how Scotlas will be developed and financed. It proposes what they call a first wave offering built on supporting land and property transactions, and suggests examples of the data sets that should be included, really quite a wide range of data sets required principally by solicitors engaged in property transactions. It ranges from planning, mains water and utilities, rights of way, insolvencies, energy performance certificates, and radon risks. And the plan was to launch this first wave of Scotlas in October 2017 to coincide with the 400th anniversary of the establishment of the Register of Saisines in 1617. And in the report, a key benefit was stated as follows. The purpose of Scotlas is to enable users to access quickly and easily information about any piece of land and property in Scotland through a single online inquiry point. This will make for easier access to key information for the citizen, support smarter conveyancing, and provide better access to important information to support policy and other decision-making, while improving accountability and transparency and creating wider social and economic benefits through innovative use of data, end quote. So Registers of Scotland did, in fact, launch Scotlas successfully in October 2017. It's popular with the public and with, as I understand it, professional data users, but it includes only data derived from the land register. In other words, one piece of a very large jigsaw around land information. And so none of the other data sources that I mentioned, radon risks, etc., proposed for the first wave were available, and that remains the situation today. The task force ended its work when the service was launched. As I say, Scotlas is a successful service for those wishing access to the land register, but we have not collectively achieved the commitment set out by the Deputy First Minister in 2015 for a comprehensive one-stop digital database for land and information services. So why wasn't it delivered, and what are the challenges? Well, the report suggests that it was a failure to put in place an appropriate governance framework that was at the root of the problem. Registers of Scotland have done an excellent job with their Scotlas system, which you have, if you haven't looked at it, just Google Scotlas and you'll find it. But no other public data holders joined the project. And of course, Registers of Scotland have got no authority to require them to do so. And so this is a key challenge, governance, making sure that all the parties come together to do an agreed task within an agreed timetable for agreed purposes. There are other challenges. We need to ensure that the data to be collated can be used for purposes other than that for which it is collected. Now, there may be some minor legislative changes needed around some of that, but we think it's modest. A further challenge is how to structure the governance of Scotland. Should it be public sector led, private sector led? Fundamentally, it doesn't really matter as long as the objectives are clear and there's clear accountability. There are also technical challenges of collating data in a modern format, but this has been successfully met in many other systems of land administration. And finally, there's a financial challenge in paying for the development and ongoing administration. We don't provide any estimates of costs, neither are they provided in the 2015 paper. But this is probably the least of the challenges. It's in the interests of the public sector to be collecting and maintaining data sets in as efficient a manner as possible. And the technical means exist to integrate this into a one-stop portal. Charging regimes, we don't talk about them, but they can still be implemented. For the consumer, it's not so much the cost of obtaining data, although that is an issue in some cases, that causes frustration, so much as the time and associated expense of doing so from a lot of very disaggregated sources. So to conclude, many countries have implemented successful land information systems, and international institutions such as the World Bank have been very busy encouraging and supporting such developments around the world. Now, Scotland did show signs of leadership back in 2015, but to conclude, the commitment entered into in 2015 has not yet been delivered. And the paper basically calls for that commitment to be met. There are no plans to do so at the moment. And as I say, what we call for in the paper simply is that that commitment be met, which we estimate could be done within 2 years if there is the political support, the political will, and engagement from all the stakeholders that require to come together to deliver it. So thanks for that, and I now hand you over to Stewart.
Morning, everyone, and thanks, Andy. Scotland, or Scotland 2.0, as some call it, has been a success, as Andy has said, and I'm proud of what has been achieved so far. It also has to be said that we've got to thank Registers of Scotland for the work they've done on the project, albeit that they obviously benefited by using Scotland to replace Registers Direct, which was a system of gaining access to title deeds held by registers. Part of the vision of Unified Scotland when it was set up has been met, namely improved access to Registers of Scotland data, particularly by the citizen who can access data free of charge themselves and obtain copies at a modest charge. And that access is the same access that I as a solicitor have. And I think that is exactly the way it should be. If we use an analogy from childhood for those of us of a certain age, Scotland is a window on the land register and the register of Sazines, which can be used by all. That was and is a driver for a national database of information on land and property. The world has moved on from the inception of Scotland 2.0, however, and most certainly from when Scotland was originally envisaged in the 1990s. These days, major consumers of property data prefer to do so by way of what is known as APIs, which were not even thought of when Scotland was created, and as I've just shown, I can't even pronounce properly. That raises other issues for Registers of Scotland with regard to them making data belonging to them available. We have to remember that the keeper of the Registers of Scotland has a statutory duty to maintain these registers as a single source of truth. That principle has stood us in good stead since 1617, when the Registers of Sazines was established. Part of that obligation means that the keeper cannot be in the business of releasing property data if there is even the remotest threat that a duplicate register could be created. And I say that simply to set a sort of a benchmark against which we have to look at enhancements to Scotlas. Any change in the keeper's responsibilities would require legislation. That having been said, I do believe that enhancements could be made to Scotlas, which would go towards meeting more of Unify Scotland's original vision for a national database of Scotland's land and property, and also, as Andy has said, what was contained within the report of the working group, which reported in 2015. One example is the addition of historic maps to Scotlas. Historic maps have been a major benefit to conveyancers. I'd like to say that it's been a major benefit to all conveyancers, but if I'm perfectly honest, I still encounter many conveyancers who don't access or don't even know that there is a button on the page for business users when using Scotlas that you can immediately compare and contrast the red line on the title sheet of the property that you're looking at against historic maps which are out of copyright and are held by the National Library of Scotland. And special thanks should be extended to the National Library of Scotland for responding so quickly to the request that I made to them that they make this data available at their cost. I didn't ask them to do it at their cost, but they did it at their cost. Now, when a solicitor is examining title on a property transaction, you are governed by in a land registered title, by the red line round the property, which comes at a scale of either 1 to 1250, 1 to 2500, or 1 to 10,000. And the obvious issue is the scale of that, of the base map or the Ordnance Survey map. The mere ability to be able to compare and contrast the plan that is on the title sheet with historic maps, and for that information to be freely available within Scotlas, is, in my opinion, a perfect example of how we can begin to enhance Scotlas for the benefit of not just solicitors undertaking property transactions, but also every single individual. If you look at a system such as exists in Norway, for example, a citizen can go into a library, go into a unit on the high street, as I have done when we were investigating this, key in the postcode or the title number, and immediately comes up the extent of that property, the route of services serving the property, and other core information which the citizen can access and use for the benefit of their existence in the property. So can we do more than just historic maps? Well, yes, I think we can. There is a list in the 2015 report, and some obvious examples that I continue to chip away at is data with regard to septic tanks. Now, septic tanks may not be an issue for many citizens in Scotland, but they are in rural properties, and just the very existence of knowing where the septic tank is located, where the outfall is, what type of septic tank it is, that data is available. And if we held that also in Scotlas, then it would give a one-stop shop, as it were, rather than having to multi-dip into various silos. Other examples might be rights of way, and the one that I would like to see, and it would require more careful consideration, is a register of home reports. At the moment, home reports are done on a daily basis. The information is used by prospective purchasers, and that has been a major improvement to the home moving process. But once we have that information, it is not used again. It disappears into the ether. Now, the data contained within that home report ought to be better accessed. And I'm encouraged that there are policy advisors within Scottish Government who have been looking at this and who hopefully will be able to look at this in more detail. But of course, this all costs money. Who is going to meet the cost of improvements? Scotlas was set up by Registers of Scotland, and it works. However, registers no longer have a bespoke reserve for such developments. As I understand it, surplus funds are now held centrally by Scottish Government. So government funding is required for what we would like to see. Today's event is an opportunity for us to see what users of the system want and to establish if we together can advance matters. In my opinion, Scotland has the potential of being a leading digital economy, and access to and use of property data is one step on that journey. An immediate objective, however, is for us to be able to retain the data that is generated daily with regard to Scotland's land and property, but is not stored in any meaningful way. And the example I've given is the information contained within home reports. If there was a register of such data, it could be accessed and used to improve the quality of Scotland's housing stock, which incidentally was the very objective of the Housing Improvement Task Force in 2005 or thereby. Of course, that will cost money, but first of all, there has to be a desire to change systems for the better. Scotland can be developed to hold more data, but the scope and cost of that need to be established. Rather than people like me writing articles about the subject, I think that we should establish a short life working group to investigate matters. It's time to take this on to the next stage and deliver on the original objectives of both ScotLIS 1 and ScotLIS 2. Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank both Stewart and Andy, and thank you both also for putting your cameras back on. First of all, I can already see some questions coming in, but I would remind people to put their questions into the chat. I'm just going to ask Andy if you've any reflection on the further comments that Stewart gave.
I have, but I've said quite a bit. I think I'll maybe chip in later when some questions come in and we see the direction of flow of the conversation.
Absolutely, no problem at all. I will also direct people to have a look at the chat because I can see a great amount of information being put into the chat by everybody who's attending. I can see that we've got information about sort of use of registers of Scotland. We've got international examples. There's all sorts of things coming up. There are a couple of comments around data transparency, and I can see we've got a question specifically from Kerry Doyle. I'd like to invite them to ask their question first, please, and then I'll come to Charles Strang. Kerry, are you able to unmute? I'm not getting anything there. Charles Strang in that case, please. If you'd like to voice your question.
Can you read my question, please, Ailsa? I can't remember it and I can't find it on my phone now.
No problem at all, Charles.
Thanks.
The question was, and this is in the words put into the chat, everyone recognises the benefits of knowing who or what owns land in Scotland. Are there vested interests that prevent this from happening, and how can they be effectively countered?
Well,
that's
yeah. I'll take that first. I mean, Scotland has led the world actually in the knowledge about who owns Scotland, in the sense that we set up the first register in 1617 under the Registration Act, which is still a live register and has been overtaken now by the Land Register, and there's a plan to complete it. So the fact is we have all that information. There's a separate question about how it's designed, how it's made available, and all the rest of it. And historically, of course, that information has been designed to protect property rights. That was the function of setting it up in 1617, was that the law is such that you don't own property unless you occupy it, you possess it, and you have a register title. And so it ended, or ended within a matter of decades. Well, it hasn't completely ended, but it substantially ended all the uncertainties about who owns land. I would say there's no real vested interests standing in the way of better information about land and property. We now have a register of controlled interests in persons and controlled interests in land. We have the register of overseas entities established under by the UK government, which is now live. I think the direction of travel on all of this is more transparency. I have no real concerns that there are any substantial vested interest standing in the way of that.
Stewart, do you have anything to add there?
Not really. I agree with Andy. There is, in my opinion, there are no vested interests. The property data held in Register of Saisines and the Land Register is publicly accessible data. And through Scotland, we have that window into that data. And for a very modest charge of £3 plus VAT, we can pick up a copy of the title sheet.
Thank you very much for that clarity. I would like to welcome a question by Nigel Wally. If you're able to unmute and ask your question. Thank you very much.
I'm unmuted.
You are indeed.
That's great. So I had a question about whether we're creating a privacy problem here. I have no issues with land data and land ownership data being made public. I think as we move into property data, I think it becomes more problematic. And I absolutely support Stuart's aim that in Scotland we should have an absolute world-beating digital environment. And I would just point out that in personal data, as we saw with the EU's GDPR, there was alongside the progress to digitising all of the personal data in the e-commerce world, there was a need to put in privacy legislation. And at the moment, we are edging towards a world in which there is an assumption which all personal residential property data is in the public realm. So currently we put all of of a home's EPC data, not just its rating, all of the calculations that the RDSAP data and the survey data into the public realm, with no explanation of why that has to be there, when the rating is the only thing that's actually key. We're now hearing from the retrofit world that we should be putting smart meter data into the public good for an undefined public good as of yet. Whereas the smart meter data is very intimate into the way a home operates. There's been no public debate about why a home's energy use, its fabric condition, its net zero status should be publicly available. I'm very happy to share the rating of my home, very happy to share ownership details. I have no idea why you think it should be relevant to put energy use and energy performance data of my home in the public realm.
Thank you very much.
Apart from the fact that some of that data is already in the public realm in the form of EPC data, I agree, Nigel, the overall principle of the use of data, be it personal or property data, requires further consideration. We just can't make a jump from 1 to 10 without actually thinking about the matter logically to assess what is the information that is required, who will access it, what is the cost of accessing. So yes, that would have to be a matter that would require careful consideration.
I should declare I run a digital property logbook company, so our interest is in actually giving the homeowner the tools to own their own data and manage it and make the data accessible to only those people who need to have it for a particular regulatory reason or a particular work reason.
Can I say, I mean, Nigel raises an important point about privacy, and I agree with Stewart in terms of data. There are privacy considerations, etc. But as a general rule, information, objective information about land and property, but its ownership and use and standards and condition and history, it is in the public interest for that to be available. Because if we're trying to, for example, improve the energy efficiency of a lot of our built environment, it's impossible to do that without good data to inform how to do it, where to do it, how much it's going to cost. So I would argue that in general terms, this is all public data, an interest, that there's a public interest in understanding the status and condition of our built environment for policymaking purposes. Now, how granular that should be, how much available should be, information should be available on a very individualized property basis, and to whom, is a question. But in principle, as much of this information should be in the public domain as possible.
Thank you very much. I'm going to move on to a question that I've got through the chat from Robin McLaren, who can't unmute, and I don't know if DHI are able to unmute him, so excuse me, I'm just going to look at another screen to read this. The use of Scotland to support land and property transactions is a small part to an extent of the wider Scotland vision. Who should take the lead in the governance of this to ensure the wider vision is achieved? I believe that Robin has been involved in this work previously, but I'd like to hear your views on this, Andy and Stewart.
Well, I'll just kick off. Stewart was involved in the working group that was set up in 2015, and that included a wide range of people. I think in terms of the governance framework, this, as I say, this could be private or public led, but it has to be within a publicly agreed governance framework, and has to be publicly agreed rules apply. Much of the data we're talking about here is public data after all. And I think it's important within that governance framework to have not just representatives of the people who hold data, but also users. So, for example, the National Union of Journalists would be one I would like to see there. The media have an important role in holding power to account and all the rest of it. I'd like to see citizens groups. I'd like to see environmental NGOs. I certainly like to see public bodies, local authorities. So really, all with an interest, but there's a difference, of course, between developing this and its future governance. And both are related, of course, but in terms of its future governance, I think that has to be a mix of the caretakers, the data holders, and the users. But I have no special expertise in how to govern this, and I think Robin will probably have examples from other countries about what works and what doesn't work, which I'm sure we'll be keen to hear from in due course.
Yeah, it's a very good point that Robin raises, and as Andy said, Robin does have wide experience in this area. Times change. When the working group was set up in 2015, I don't think the issue of governance ever featured. Let's just be honest. But now governance is very important, and I think if we are going to move things forward, we would require to look carefully at the governance, and that should be as wide as possible. This is, in my opinion, a critical asset that Scotland has, and we should be looking to have as many people as possible inputting into what they want it to see. But then that will still require leadership, and that leadership, I think, has to come from government. But it's easy for me as a citizen to say government. What do I mean by government? The answer is I don't know. But I think I share Andy's point. Let's make this as wide as possible, and it's a public asset. Let's move it forward.
Thank you. In relation to that point, to an extent about public assets, there's a question that's been put in from Beth Landon, who I believe is unable to unmute. But my apologies if I'm speaking on your behalf. It says, before the proposed updates to ScotLIS have time to be implemented, would it be possible for local authority planning departments to make information not currently in ScotLIS, but in restricted access databases containing information on land available to community bodies? And the example mentioned specifically here is those developing local place plans, which is obviously part of the new national planning framework.
The answer is yes, we should be doing that. It has to be better. I think the information that planning authorities hold is consistent in that across Scotland, in that they all hold the information, but access to that information is not consistent. And that depends to a large degree on the way in particular local authorities have bought into the concept of making that data more freely available. There are good examples and bad examples, and I certainly wouldn't want to either give praise or to shame any those who perhaps are not moving as fast as others. But yes, planning data is hugely important on a daily basis. And I think we need to learn from the good examples that are there. And there are good examples of local authorities making that data available. And I think we can liaise with others who are specialists in this field to actually look at how that information could be made available. It could be directly into Scotland, but it could be a link into Scotland, that the silos communicate instead of being separate at the moment, because the silo mentality leads to delay. The poorer the information, the less information that is out there, the more that people like me have to go hunting for that information, the greater the cost to the consumer is. And so if we have better upfront information, that should help shorten the timescale and lead to an improved home moving process.
We have obviously talked about a few of the challenges around this, and you've both mentioned examples in passing. But where is doing this well? What countries can we learn from directly in relation to this?
If you want an image of what could really happen, have a look at Singapore. Now, as a sovereign state and small in size and very wealthy, they've created a system which is quite frankly unbelievable. You have a 3D image of any particular property. The example that I saw was of the really fancy hotel down on the waterfront that looks like a boat. You can actually look at under the ground into that and see all the pipes and the networks, that everything is there. That's all within their land information service. That's at one end. The country that I've looked at most out with Scotland was Norway, and I referred to that in my introductory remarks. Their national land information system, which is now known as Ambita, it's exemplary. It's just part of the fabric. It's available to all. There's no special qualifications to be able to access it. If you need to gain advice, if you need advice on the information that you gain from Ambita, then that is, you then have to go and consult someone and ask for that advice. But a large part of that information is freely available to the citizen. So Norway, to me, is one. And I know that Robin has many other examples that he's been involved with over the years. We have the opportunity of having a system like that.
Yeah, just to mention, Robin says in the chat, Netherlands, Denmark, Norway, Lithuania, New Zealand, some of the examples he's citing. And as Stuart said, I mean, the 2015 report was very much based on the Norwegian experience. I certainly had the impression at the time that whilst you can't lift things directly, much of this technology, much of the kind of policy framework around all this is broadly similar across countries, certainly in Western Europe and all of Europe now. And so that adds to my disappointment, that didn't get delivered for whatever reason. But it highlights the point that others have done this. It's not an incredibly difficult task. It's one that's worth investing time and money in because it has huge upsides after it's completed.
I think a word on the Norwegian system, it's a bit like, there's a bit of like buying something through Amazon. There's a bit of a drop-down list of information that you can obtain. And you can click and it goes into your box or your basket at checkout. And some of the people who use that are lenders who are going in to obtain information when mortgaging or remortgaging a property. So you can buy a lender's pack, you can buy another pack. But the interesting thing of these examples in Norway and Denmark in particular, which is another jurisdiction that I've looked very carefully at, the legal profession in Denmark had their monopoly over conveyancing removed overnight by the government. And as you would envisage, all hell broke loose. My God, what's going to happen now? The world will crumble. It didn't. What happened was another organization called Danske Bolig Advocater was created within the Danish Law Society, but separate from it. And to the extent that they're now very much the go-to voice of the home moving process in Denmark. And that, along with their national land information system, has improved the efficiency of the home moving process. It does, in equal measure, disappoint me, and well, it probably disappoints me rather than equal measure, the criticisms that will be universally levied towards the legal profession as if we are solely responsible for the problems in the home moving process. We're not. It's the problems in the home moving process are multifaceted. And why I've always been keen to build on the work of those behind the original Scotlas and take Scotlas 2 forward and hopefully Scotlas 3 is that we make that system better. And by better, I mean more efficient, less of a delay, and less costly. And that may seem strange for a solicitor to say, but I passionately believe that the system has to be better. And with the land registration system moving apace, as Andy has said, and a significant proportion of Scotland's land and property now on the land register, we have the ability, as we improve other aspects of the home moving process, to totally revolutionize and change the way we do things. There is a question in the chat about boundaries, which I'm more than happy to answer at an appropriate stage.
Thank you for that. There is a lot of information coming in between attendees. There are a couple of questions that fundamentally all hedge around, in relation to home reports specifically, but a sort of privately paid for data then becoming a public resource, and sort of I suppose just the why should that happen aspect of things. And it's not necessarily, I think, challenging the privacy issue. It's more the sort of private spend, and then what we do with it afterwards nationally. I would like to hear any views on that one.
Yeah,
well,
it's a good point. Sorry, Andy, you go.
A lot of data about land has been paid for privately. I mean, if you think of the costs of land registration, for example, you know, buyers and sellers are paying money to solicitors and surveyors and the Registers of Scotland and all the rest of it. Registers of Scotland have a cost too. But the bottom line is a lot of this information is collected, historically has been, by the private and the public sector working together. And the private sector paying for some of this, in the case of home reports, of course, is doing that under a statutory duty to do so. And it's been determined by Parliament that that's the best way of paying for it. Now, there might be a better way of paying for it. I don't know if the public could pay for them, whatever. But that's how it's dealt with. And the question here is not so much because it's been paid for privately, should it be public? The bottom line is, what is the information contained in there? And is there a public interest in having that at least more widely available, if not completely publicly available? And as I did an answer to an earlier question, a lot of the built environment is privately owned, but it is also a public resource. It will long outlast, hopefully, many of the people who currently own and occupy it. And therefore, it's in the public interest that we know as much as possible about our built environment, both so that we can go back in time to fix things, mend things, and restore things, and so that we can go forward in time to ensure that people in the future know as much as they possibly can about what it is they have bought, which has been owned by a succession of other people in the years past. And to that extent, home reports, although they're fairly modest in what they say, are part of that information journey. And the idea that, you know, there's some kind of private document just for those who are occupying property at that particular point in time. Yes, they are in part, but they're also part of a rich information landscape that goes with that property and in a sense should run with that property for as long as that property exists, for the benefit not only of those who own and occupy it in future, but also to ensure that policymakers, local government and regulators, etc., understand the built environment and what it's like. And I feel quite strongly about that. And I don't think the connection between who pays and whether it should be public is necessarily a useful one.
Yeah, to add to that, I think, as I said in answer to Nigel's question earlier, the whole issue of data, the personal and property data, would require to be carefully considered. But if we can just step back and look at this more in the abstract, which is the purpose of today after all. I sat on subgroup B of the Housing Improvement Task Force, and subgroup B was responsible for the introduction of the Home Report. The Home Report had a rocky ride initially. A lot of people were against it, principally the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors. It has been introduced, however. It has legislative backing, as Andy has said. Is it perfect? No, it's not. Does it contain, in my opinion, more disclaimers on occasion than actual data? Yes. So that has to be improved. The truth of the matter, however, is that prior to the introduction of the Home Report, 97% of people who were buying a property in Scotland relied on a mortgage valuation. There being three different types of survey: one, the full structural; two, a home buyer's or property inspection report; and three, a mortgage valuation. And most people relied on a mortgage valuation. Why? Because they thought they weren't having to pay for it. It was being paid for out of the lending facility, but of course they were paying. The Home Report looks like what we would call a home buyer's report, the middle report, because it's lengthy, because it contains diagrams, and because it just looks like a home buyer's report, but it's not. It's a glorified valuation report. But even with that qualification, and the qualification that it requires to be improved, home buyers in Scotland have better information available to them today than they had prior to the introduction of the Home Report. And that is a good thing. The big problem that the government were looking to achieve and to solve was the elimination of multiple surveys, where 25 people were going for a popular property at a closing date and multi-surveys were being carried out. That was cut at a stroke by the introduction of the Home Report. And it's a good example of what can be done to improve the system that affects us all when we're looking to buy or sell arguably the single most important asset that we personally have. But as Andy has said, how that asset then fits into the larger fabric of society. The remit of that group who introduced the report was limited, and certain aspects were not advanced because they were out with the original remit. But a failure of the Home Report is that if I put my property on the market today, I have to have a Home Report. So I pay £500, let's say £500 to get that Home Report. It tells me my property is worth £200,000 and there are £25,000 worth of repairs. I don't like that. So I go and spend another £500. That tells me my property is worth £225,000 with £15,000 worth of repairs. I still don't like that. So I commission a third report. That tells me my property is worth £275,000, no repairs. Which one am I going to choose? I put the property on the market with that Home Report. No one knows there have been two earlier Home Reports. So for £1,500, I'm ahead of the game. Now, that is one example, and there will be other examples of where we can improve the Home Report. But in my view, it's all about the data and the data contained within that and the public good. I do not want there to be another situation of a piece of coping stone falling off a cafe, whether it's in Edinburgh, Glasgow, Dingwall, or wherever, and killing someone underneath, because that information may or may not have been reported previously and nothing has been done about it.
Thank you, Stuart. I'm going to use Chair's prerogative to make a very related point on this around the information contained within home reports. It's one of those things that without access to information about the age, material and condition of all of our buildings, we're not able as a nation to plan for the related skills, the related materials and all of the related jobs that sit along with that. So it's one of those things where individually I can see why people, you know, might hold on tightly to that information, but actually what we can do on a much wider scale, very necessary interventions for the future, whether that's around retrofit, whether that's around maintenance and ensuring sort of public health and safety and that sort of thing, that's the sort of information that this can really help to unlock. I appreciate as chair, it's a little greedy to be able to make those points, but I think that Susan would also like to come in at this point.
Yes, thanks very much. And I just wanted to come in because there's been so many questions about home reports, and that isn't what the report is about, but it was the way that David Hume Institute ended up in this conversation. And I kind of want to bring back around the so what. Why are we involved as a think tank that's interested in the economy and related society? And that's because in a chance research conversation to do with something called the Action Project. For those of you that follow us, you'll know we did a massive research project a couple of years ago, speaking to over 5,000 people in Scotland. And one of those conversations, a small business owner, I think it was either a plumber or an electrician, I'm pretty sure it was an electrician, said to us, I find it really difficult to know how many apprentices to take on. I'm being told by government there's a massive need to retrofit, and I know houses in our area are going to need rewiring, they're probably going to need heat pumps, but I don't know the volume of people to train, and it takes me, you know, several years to train an apprentice, and there's no way of me getting any information to know how many homes in my area have already got, you know, said rewiring or the heat pumps. So it's kind of how could we, you know, even if data protection means that we can't do individual properties, can we aggregate data? You know, is there a way that we can help businesses plan to know exactly how many skills they, maybe not exactly, but maybe a broad estimate of how many people they might need to train in a certain area, you know, and take the risk off them a bit that they might be training loads of people that they might not have work for in future. And that was how we entered this conversation. And then it just snowballed that we found out there was this thing called ScotList and all these other bits of information that were meant to be in there originally. And I thought that bit of context might be useful at this point. I'm also just checking with the team, because we're doing a lot of tech behind the scenes. We know Robin Macfarlane can't unmute himself, but Tom, could you have a go and see if you can unmute Robin, and he's might be able to talk to us about some of the international examples.
Yeah,
is Robin here? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thanks. I'm actually in France skiing, so it shows you the importance of ScotList to not ski today to listen to this. So, so I've got a couple of issues for you from my international experience. One is looking at the socioeconomic impact assessment of initiatives like ScotList. The Netherlands and Denmark especially ran some fantastic business cases to justify the investment in their LIS. And I think that must be a priority for Scotland to do this. In Denmark, the lead is the Ministry of Finance, which I think is a fantastic way to lead it. And so they forced people to come up with the sustainable business cases, and it's been a great success. So that's my first comment. The second is about key registers. The examples I gave of successful international examples all started by sorting out their key registers. So that's information, authoritative information about people, land and property and businesses. That's all uniquely referenced. For example, we have a unique property reference number in the UK that's not used across the divide. Addresses are a mess in the UK. that was all sorted out by these countries. And so they have very strong, robust, sustainable key registers, and that drives the whole of the applications. The data becomes interoperable, easy to access, and you can start to develop fantastic services built on the data we have. So to me, that's a starting point for Scotland, is to sort out the key registers. And that's our challenge, especially when it comes to governance, because it goes cross ministry and cross departments to get things sorted out. And so we need really strong governance to enact this and make it work. So there's my basic comments about where you should start from and some of the fundamentals to convince the politicians and the financiers and the private sector to get involved. Thanks.
I think Robin raises a very good point about UPRNs. And I agree with him. I think starting with the finance background, the finance angle is a really good way to move this forward. If we look at, he used the word registers. And obviously, as a solicitor, I think registers as Registers of Scotland. The quality of Scotland's registers of property, and now the controlling interests in land and overseas entities, etc., is governed by statute. And I think they're in very safe hands. It's the other stuff that is sort of moving around, but we can't actually pin it down and actually use it for our benefit. The UPRN used to be a major problem. The unique property reference numbers was a major problem because there were different systems. And the anecdote I sometimes use is that if you had a fire in your property, until recently, there was no guarantee that the police, the fire brigade, and the ambulance service would all arrive at the same property because they use different UPRNs. There's a degree of consolidation happening in that now. I'm slightly unaware as to exactly where that's got to, but I know that Alan Howie at Registers of Scotland, who's been deeply involved in Scotland, has done a lot of work in that space. If there is still some additional work to be done with UPRNs in order that we have that UPRN single point of reference, then let's get doing it. One of the difficult areas that has always been quoted to me are tenement flats. And of course, we have a lot of tenement buildings in Scotland. They're not immune, as I've done personally myself, and made a mistake when describing a property in a tenement. You can stand outside the tenement and look at it, and you know what the east and the west is. Then you go into the stair and look at the property, and you can make a mistake. UPRNs for individual flats within a multi-occupancy building is probably an area that still requires has some work done to it. But once you've got that, as Robin has said, once you have the UPRN, once you have that data, and once you have the political and financial will, this can be done.
I'd like to bring Alan in at this point, actually, in relation to the registers. I think you're probably able to unmute yourself.
Yes, I have indeed. Good afternoon, everyone. This has been very difficult. I'm not used to being muted for so long, but in response, yeah, UPRNs for Registers of Scotland are really important to us. Obviously, we can't use UPRNs for fields, so it's not completely ubiquitous. And generally, we're in a reasonable place. What I'm trying to do with our data strategy at the moment is to give that level of certainty. So we talked earlier about APIs, computer to computer. Computers want to know a number, which is a UPRN. They don't want 6 lines of text trying to describe an address. So they're really important for me. I won't use my bat signal analogy, which is really a bit like data. So for us, a UPRN is a great way for us to join the party and link our domain of knowledge, which is all around titles, back to the rest of the sort of Scottish community that talk about houses with UPRNs. So 6 years ago, we did a big update to do address matching. And at the moment, we're around about 80-ish%, so we're in good shape on that front. And as Stuart highlighted, one of the key problems we have is the addresses we capture on our title sheets for flatted properties, especially the old large tenements. The addresses provided really don't link to anything else. So the way I describe it is the address on the deed doesn't allow the pizza delivery man to get the pizza to your house. talks about the northernmost flat rather than, you know, you're at one high street and it's 2B and one high street. So it's an area in this role and previous roles that's passionate to my heart. And I do believe that UPRs will help us do that knitting between the different knowledge domains and give better value back to the citizens of Scotland. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much for that. I think we're hearing a lot of examples about sort of the theory that we're talking about and that sort of wider picture, but also the exact things that we need to progress, that we need to take on board to ensure that that this work can continue. I am still welcoming any questions in relation to the topic. A lot of people are very helpfully active in the chat, which is ever so slightly harder to keep track of. But Andy, I think you'd like to come in.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to pick up, I think early on you asked Carrie Doyle to come in, but she didn't. And then you went on to somebody else's question. I think her question is quite important. I've got it here. It says, I'd welcome the panel's thoughts on legal means to require data transparency, such as learning from the Inspire directive. Okay, so I don't want to go on at great length about this, but I just did want to log the Inspire directive because it's an EU directive on geospatial information. And I do not know, I just honestly do not know the extent to which this has actually been fully implemented across government in Scotland. Maybe it has, maybe it hasn't, I don't know. But it contains requirements, for example, on interoperability, etc. And I don't know what the accountability regime now is, given the fact that we're no longer members of the EU, although the Inspire Directive remains EU law in Scotland. And I think that's something for someone either to answer or to look at, because certainly it was a useful piece of legislation designed to improve the whole of the EU's journey on geospatial information.
Thank you for bringing that up, Andy. And it turns out that Alan would like to come in on that one. That's very helpful.
Once I get started, everyone, I do apologise. So on Inspire, Regions of Scotland have provided a data set on sort of ownership extents, cadastral units as they're called elsewhere. And the problem with Inspire was that the bar was very low. So they were keen to get some data instead of some data instead of a very high bar. So at the moment, what most organisations do for Inspire, which is still, even though we've come out of the EU, is still something that Scottish Government has asked us to continue doing. I think it's a valuable data set. The data set at the moment, however, really is a set of shapes. So it does give you an idea of what has been registered in the land register. The best detail we can possibly provide, it's not dumbed down in any way, but it doesn't have that linkage at this moment in time back to titles or anything else. So it's a good starter for 10. The quality of the data is top notch, but it is at the lowest bar, if you like, and there are very good reasons for that.
I'm just going to keep you there, if I may. Can you just define for us what Inspire is? And I've got a follow-up question.
Yep, so Inspire was a directive, as Andy highlighted earlier, that was asked for all sorts of organisations that had spatial data. It was more importantly for Europe, we've got lots and lots of boundaries, and it's trying to give a sort of synergy and a standard reference across those boundaries in Europe. We also got involved, so we've got a different sort of data set. So land is just one area. There's a whole host. There's sea areas. I'm trying to remember them all just now, but I'm desperately needing about 12 more coffees, I think, at the moment. But that's what it was for. No. To try and give that I can't say it, that crossover between countries, that meshed view of the world.
That's really helpful. Thank you. And Andy shared a link in the chat to the Inspire directive itself. There was also a question. There was also a question much earlier on about sort of the specificity of land boundaries within Scotland, and that sort of the specificity can be missing, which can lead to all sorts of issues. Do you have any specific view or information on that one? I will try and find the exact question.
No, I've already contacted the person and I've offered an email to give an update offline just to make sure that they're comfortable. it's a combination. Yeah, it's been dealt with offline. Email's been sent.
Brilliant. That's even more helpful. Thank you very much.
It's also not really directly a question about Scotland. It's just some of the information within Scotland. But I think it does demonstrate a major problem that citizens and indeed solicitors have from time to time when they're seeking to interpret title sheets, which in turn are based on the Ordnance Survey map, which in turn is updated regularly, and the tolerances that lie around these measurements. And I'm glad to hear that Alan will deal with it offline. It is a bigger subject, and it is a problem area that we're going to encounter down the line once we have all of Scotland's land and property on the land register. It's what we refer to, what is often referred to are underlaps and overlaps. How are we going to deal with these? But that's not an issue for Scotland. It's a land registration law and practice.
Thank you for the clarity. One of the things that that Robin mentioned specifically was about sort of the value and benefit to an integrated system such as this. And you know, if you keep an eye on policy areas, we can see that Scottish Government has announced sort of a data strategy for health and social care, and there's insight going on into unlocking the value of public sector data for public benefit. How can we better express the benefits around this work as well as the work itself?
I'd kick it off by saying that the first and foremost benefit is that an individual member of the public today has the ability to get information about her or his property instantly by going online. If they can't go online, go into a library, get help. If they have a question from that, then they should seek further advice. But that is in complete stark contrast to the way it was previously. And what we're looking to do is to see how that benefit can be increased, how there can be greater benefits for individuals to get information about their property. Some might regard this as a bit of a snooper's charter, possibly. Will it stop anyone wanting to know about a neighbouring property? No. Is it a good thing that I can go online and check the boundary of my property as registered, and whether or not there's an overlap with the adjoining property, which either is not registered in the land register or is registered in the land register, with a view to seeking to have that discrepancy clarified, investigated and dealt with. No one's looking to turn this into World War III between neighbours, although a significant number of the opinions I get involved in do seem like World War III over small boundaries. But Scotland helps the citizen, and we've given more information to the citizen than has ever been there before, and that is a good thing. And that's why Scotland so far has been a success.
I would say the person, Carrie Doyle, who asked the question about Inspire, is involved in urban land issues in the west of Scotland, and their kind of studies with communities demonstrated that it was the difficulty of finding information about particularly small areas of kind of vacant or derelict land that communities were interested in, that in and of itself acts as a barrier to action, because when you're kind of just knocking your head against brick walls, you give up. Or the ordinary citizen does give up. So I think some of the benefits of this for the ordinary citizen are not just that they'll be able to obtain professional services more cheaply and more efficiently, but it's to do with people's better understanding of their own community and their own environment, which is really, really important. And I think one way we can do this is not just through examples of where people have, I highlighted a few, for example, common grazings not being able to be transferred because of poor record keeping on shareholders. But there'll be many of these examples around Scotland, and we can present them as small case studies of where people are not even able to start doing what they aspire to do, or even to evaluate whether what they would like to do, they can do, because they stumble at the very first hurdle, which is often data. And that seems to be really stupid. And Robin also made the point, of course, of a business case, and that is critical to all of this in the past. And I think, with all due respect to the solicitors around, a lot of the focus on land information has been about conveyancing and property transactions, and a lot of movement has been made in that regard. A lot more work needs to be done in that regard, but it's actually the other areas of land information that have been rather neglected for the ordinary citizen. So I think a series of case studies, professional and personal examples would be good, pulling that together, because as Robin says, we do need that business case. I mean, government needs to be persuaded to invest at the very least the time and effort. Public authorities need to be persuaded to invest the time and effort into doing this, and therefore there need to be clear advantages and benefits.
Absolutely, and I think making that business case is something that I'm particularly interested in seeing. And going back to the point that Susan made earlier about those wider societal shifts in terms of how we understand and use data for the benefits of sort of public health, public safety, skills and jobs for the future, and really sort of getting away from the siloed thinking, perhaps. And I'm getting comments about sort of more worldwide examples where there's far greater access to data and tax information that really enables countries to look at that information quite differently, and how tightly we hold it can perhaps be slightly more of an issue here currently. We are getting towards the very end of the session, and I'm very happy to see if there are any more questions coming in. But while I just have a quick check for that, I would like to invite the two panelists to give their final thoughts. But I appreciate there's an awful lot to take away from this discussion. And before Stuart and Andy give us some final thoughts, I'm just going to highlight that if you've enjoyed this discussion today and you're not already subscribed to the DHI mailing list, do get in touch with the David Hume Institute team to make sure that you don't miss out on any future discussions. And it would be remiss if I didn't also mention that BEFS has a twice monthly free bulletin that brings information and comment from across policy relating to the built environment and strategic developments within that sector, and you can sign up via our website. Regular attendees will know that DHI events are free and open to everyone as part of that commitment to diversity of thought. But do please remember that as a charity, they can only continue to bring these free events as a result of donations. So get in touch with the DHI team if you would like to support any future work. I believe we have a final question, and actually in your summations, I think this very much comes into it. There's a lot of expert interventions that have been in the room. We've had a lot of very detailed comments within the chat in relation to a what next. How are we inviting people to form a working group? Who needs to do that? And what work can we continue? I'll hand over to you first, Andy.
Well, I won't answer that specifically. I mean, I'm a sole trader and I don't have much experience in how you take these things forward. I mean, I think it is a bit frustrating that we had all the good work in 2015 and it only partially delivered. And I think the central question is a political with a small p question, is, are we still committed? Is government still committed to delivering on the ambitions set out by the working group, by the keeper of the Registers of Scotland in 2015? And I think as an early action, I think some engagement with government around what their thinking is on this, it would be useful, because if they're not perfectly entitled to take that view, then there may be alternative ways of taking this forward. And I just want to sort of conclude as well that with the thought, I mean, I've been looking closely in recent months about the whole question of climate finance and carbon, etc. And that's a good example of another emerging data field around carbon that we have very little data on. We've set up a new thing called the UK Carbon Registry, another standalone registry with no links whatsoever to any other ones. And yet, if you want to buy land, for example, and you find actually that there's a legal commitment has been entered into on that land, that all the carbon credits have been sold, and you can't, I don't know, fell the trees or whatever, that's important information. So I just want to highlight, sort of downer here, but we are actually continuing to invent and create new policies and new data frameworks that are further confusing the picture. And I think that's a good example of why, not only with new emerging data, but with existing data, we really do need to get our act together and eliminate all of these inefficiencies, which are not just bad for business and bad for the consumer, they're also bad for the citizen, because it's effectively denying them access to high quality information about their community and their environment, to which in fact they have a legal right.
Thank you, Andy. Stewart.
Yeah, I agree with that, Andy. I think there might be many people out there who are surprised that Andy and I are in agreement on something, but we're more in agreement than we are in disagreement on these things. Yeah, we've got to remember what the core message is, and it's to get better access to land and property and land information in Scotland. It's so easy when we have a discussion like this for us to go shooting off at tangents, because that is largely because of the nature of conveyancing, the home moving process. And as soon as anyone starts to look at improving it or changing it, then, and this harks back to a question earlier in the proceedings, vested interests come to the front. And when I say vested interests, I don't mean any major institution or organization. It's just that people protect what they've got, and they protect the way they do things, and they don't like change. So let's try and stay central to the core message that was behind the introduction of Scotland as a concept in the 90s, was then there in 2015. We had it in that report. And then I think we've got to consider how best to enable a grown-up discussion with government so that we can achieve these aims and objectives, or at least some of these aims and objectives. I'm not against doing things in small steps. Throughout my career, I've been more prone to try and jump from across all the steps and get to the finishing one. But no, we've got to take this as a series of small steps, and that must be with the involvement of government. And for government to get involved, we've got to be singing off the same hymn sheet. We've not got to be wrestling around like ferrets in a sack. The principle of Scotland is, in my view, sound, and it could be better. So how do we make it better?
Thank you very much, Stewart and Andy. I will again recommend the report released today to everybody that just has the background information on this, as well as a discussion of multiple data sources. And I think that the closing words around the intent that we need to all be on the same page, but within a policy arena, I have to say this is an area on which I see more agreement than I see disagreement at any point. Everybody seems to agree on the direction of travel, the why for the direction of travel. It's just enabling the right focused work to incrementally make the improvements that we really think would benefit everybody. I think that call from Andy, that there is a right to this information for so many different benefits that we absolutely need to be able to express at sort of human scale and at national scale. I will now give a final thanks to Stewart and Andy, and also to Susan and the David Hume Institute, who have been very much taking the lead on today's event and helping with all of the tech. And a thank you to all of the attendees, and particularly all the information that's been shared today. The chat will be captured by David Hume so that we can ensure we're sort of taking the points raised and made into account. The recording of this is also going to be made available afterwards on the David Hume Institute website, so that you can watch or share with others. And I will just bring today for a close to say thank you for joining us, and as organisations and as individuals, we very much look forward to seeing you at future events. Thank you very much.